Paul said. "Can you play this exactly as written?" Jimi touched the guitar strings, and then he stopped. That silence made everyone in the room rethink what music actually meant. London, March 1967. A private recording studio tucked behind a row of converted warehouses in Soho. The kind of place you found only if someone gave you directions twice. Small. Cramped. Walls covered in egg cartons for soundproofing. 2 amplifiers. A worn wooden floor. Cigarette burns on the windowsill. It was nearly 3 a.m. The session had been over for hours, but 6 people remained. Studio musicians who'd worked late and stayed later. Paul McCartney had stopped by, as he sometimes did in those days, looking for a quiet place to work through some ideas away from Abbey Road's formality. And Jimi Hendrix was there. Not performing. Not announced. Just present. Sitting on the floor near the back wall, his Stratocaster across his lap, listening while others played. He didn't always speak at these gatherings. Sometimes he'd sit for hours, contributing only through the occasional phrase he'd play, never showing off, never interrupting, just adding something when the space called for it. People who were there remembered him as almost too quiet. Respectful to the point of invisibility. Paul had been noodling with a chord progression. Stopping. Starting. Trying different voicings. The other musicians offered suggestions. Someone mentioned trying it in a different key. Someone else suggested a walking bass line. Paul stopped playing. He looked across the room at Jimi, who sat with his guitar, not playing, just listening. "Jimi," Paul said. Not loud. Just his name. Jimi looked up. "Do you know Yesterday?" "I know it." "Can you play it?" "I could." Paul smiled slightly. "No, I mean, can you play it exactly?" "Note for note. The way it's recorded." The room went quiet. Not because the question was aggressive. Paul's tone wasn't challenging. But everyone understood what was being asked. Yesterday was arguably the most famous acoustic guitar piece in the world by 1967. Recorded with a string quartet. Analyzed by music students. Played at weddings and funerals. Perfect in its simplicity. Jimi stood up slowly. He walked over to where Paul sat and took the wooden stool next to him. He positioned his Stratocaster, an electric guitar, not the acoustic Yesterday required, and rested his right hand just above the strings. His fingers hovered there. Not moving. Just waiting. Paul watched him. The other musicians watched both of them. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "You want me to play it exactly as it's written?" Jimi asked quietly. "If you can," Paul said. There was no malice in it. Just curiosity. A technical question between craftsmen. Jimi's hand stayed suspended above the strings. 5 seconds passed. 10. His eyes were closed. He wasn't preparing to play. He was deciding whether to play. Then he lowered his hand completely, letting it rest on his thigh. "I could do that," Jimi said finally. "But it wouldn't be right." Paul's eyebrows raised slightly. "Why not?" "Because you already played it perfect. You did it. There's the recording. If I play it exactly like you did, all I've done is prove I have ears and fingers. That's not music. That's copying." The room had gone completely still. One of the session musicians later said he stopped breathing. "So you won't play it?" Paul asked. "I didn't say that." Jimi's right hand returned to the guitar. This time his fingers touched the strings, but he didn't play. He just let them rest there, feeling the tension of the steel under his fingertips. "I'll play what I hear when I listen to Yesterday," Jimi said. "Not what you played. What I hear underneath it. The part that's there but nobody wrote down." Paul sat back slightly. "There's nothing underneath it. It's all there. Every note." "With respect," Jimi said, and his voice was so quiet the others had to lean forward to hear him. "Every song has a underneath. The thing you felt but didn't have time to play. Or didn't have the space to play. Or just kept for yourself? That's the part one here. Paul looked at him for a long moment. Then he gestured to the guitar. Show me. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Jimi positioned his fingers on the fretboard. He played one note. Just one. Let it ring out. It wasn't the opening note of Yesterday. It was a note from somewhere in the middle of the song, isolated, sustained, allowed to fill the small room completely before fading. Then silence. Then another note. This one lower. Bent slightly at the end, giving it a question mark quality. He wasn't playing Yesterday. He was playing around it. Through it. Under it. Like he was excavating something that had been buried beneath the famous melody. The notes he chose weren't wrong, they fit the harmonic structure perfectly, but they weren't the notes anyone expected. Paul's face was difficult to read. He wasn't smiling. Wasn't frowning. Just watching. Listening with the kind of attention that erases everything else. Jimi played for perhaps 90 seconds. Never speeding up. Never showing technique for technique's sake. Each note was given space to exist before the next one arrived. He played the emotional gaps between Paul's lyrics. The pauses where the string quartet had swelled. The silence between, all my trouble seemed so far away, and the next line. When he finished, his hand returned to his thigh. The guitar went quiet. No one spoke. One of the session musicians, a drummer who'd worked with the Rolling Stones, later told friends he felt like he just watched someone perform surgery on a song everyone thought was already perfect. Jimi didn't change it, he said. He just showed you what was always there. You feel like an idiot for not hearing it before. Paul was staring at his own hands. At the guitar he'd been playing minutes ago. When he finally looked up at Jimi, his expression was different. Softer. Something had shifted. That's not yesterday, Paul said quietly. No, Jimi agreed. It's what yesterday is standing on. I've played that song 1,000 times, Paul said. I wrote it. I've heard it more than anyone alive. And I've never heard that. Jimi shrugged slightly. You heard it when you wrote it. You just didn't have room for it in the recording. That's not a criticism. You can't put everything in. You have to choose. But the other stuff doesn't disappear. It's still there. I just played what you left behind. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He stood up and walked back to his spot against the wall. He sat down, positioning his guitar across his lap the way he'd been sitting before Paul called on him. He didn't say anything else. The conversation, for him, was over. But for Paul, it was just beginning. Paul picked up his guitar again. He played the opening of Yesterday, the actual opening, the famous one. But halfway through the first verse he stopped. Frowned. Adjusted his fingers. Tried a different voicing for one of the chords. No, he muttered to himself. That's not. He tried again. This time he played one of the notes Jimi had played, one of the underneath notes, and layered it into his own melody. The song suddenly had more depth. More dimension. Like a photograph that had been flat suddenly revealed itself to have foreground and background. Paul looked over at Jimi, who wasn't watching him. Wasn't paying attention to whether his approach had been validated. He was just sitting against the wall, eyes half closed, listening to the room the way he always did. How did you hear that? Paul asked. Jimi opened his eyes slightly. I listened to what you didn't play. But how do you know what I didn't play? Because I know what it feels like to leave something out. Everyone does. When you finish a song, there's always the ghost version. The one that exists in your head but didn't make it onto the tape. I just listened for the ghosts. One of the other musicians, a bass player named Derek, spoke up. So you're saying every song we know is incomplete? No, Jimi said. I'm saying every song is a choice. What you choose to play is complete. But the things you chose not to play are still real. They're just invisible. Most people can't hear invisible things. But they're there. The session broke up around 4:30 a.m. People gathered their instruments, said quiet goodbyes, filtered out into the London dawn. Paul stayed behind for a few minutes, sitting on the stool, replaying what Jimi had played, trying to memorize the ghost notes. Jimi was the last to leave. He walked past Paul on his way to the door, guitar case in hand. "Paul," he said. Paul looked up. "You didn't need me to play it note for note," Jimi said. "You needed to know if I would. What's the difference? One is skill. The other is respect." Jimi paused at the door. "You're one of the best to ever do this. You don't need me to copy you. You need me to show you what you're still capable of finding." He left. The door closed quietly behind him. Paul sat alone in the studio for another 20 minutes. He didn't play his guitar. He just held it, thinking about ghost notes. About the songs underneath songs. About the difference between perfection and completion. What followed stayed with everyone in the room. Long after the last note faded, Derek, the bass player, told this story at a dinner party in 1983. He was asked why he remembered such a small, private moment from 16 years earlier when so many other legendary sessions had happened during that era. "Because," Derek said, "that was the night I realized the best musicians aren't the ones who play everything. They're the ones who know what not to play." And Jimi knew that before any of us. The drummer, the one who'd worked with the Stones, included it in his memoir, though he changed the names. He wrote, "I once watched one master musician refuse to imitate another master, and instead showed him something about his own work that he'd forgotten. It was the most generous thing I've ever seen someone do with a guitar." Paul McCartney has told this story twice in interviews over the years, though never with names, never with specifics. In a 1994 interview he said, "Early in my career, someone showed me that every song has architecture you don't see. A foundation. I'd been building houses without looking at the basement. After that night, I always looked." He never said who that someone was. But people who were there knew. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He never recorded his version of Yesterday. Never played it on stage. The only people who heard his ghost note interpretation were the 6 people in that Soho studio in March 1967. But the lesson stayed. Paul would later say that Let It Be, written 2 years after that night, was influenced by what Jimi taught him about space. About what you leave out. About trusting that the underneath part of a song can hold as much power as what's written. The wooden stool where Jimi sat that night remained in that studio until the building was demolished in 1991. The owner, who'd been there that night, never let anyone else use it. "That's Jimi's stool," he'd say. He used it to teach Paul McCartney about humility. When the building came down, he took the stool home. It sits in his living room now. He's never played guitar on it. Some objects aren't meant for music. They're meant for remembering when music became something bigger than sound. In 2009, a music journalist tracked down 2 of the other musicians who were in that room. Both were in their 70s by then, still working, still playing. When asked what they remembered most clearly about that night, they both said the same thing without having spoken to each other in decades. "The silence after Jimi stopped playing," one said. "It wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Like we'd all just witnessed something we didn't have language for yet." The other added, "Paul looked at his guitar differently after that. I saw him the next week at another session. He was playing the same way he always did, technically. But there was something new. Gaps. Intentional spaces. Like he'd learned that emptiness could carry melody too. What Jimi understood, what he'd always understood, was that mastery isn't domination. It's not proving you're better. It's not crushing someone with your skill. Real mastery is showing someone what they already knew but had forgotten. It's holding up a mirror that reflects not their weakness, but their potential." Paul had asked for note-for-note replication because that's what musicians do. They test each other. They measure. They compare. It's how the craft works. But Jimi refused the test. Not because he couldn't pass it. Because passing it would have diminished them both. Paul would have gotten confirmation he didn't need. And Jimi would have reduced himself to a very expensive tape recorder. Instead, Jimi offered something else. Partnership. Respect. An invitation to hear his own work from a different angle. That's not teaching. That's not showing off. That's what happens when mastery meets humility and decides collaboration matters more than hierarchy. The wooden stool sits in that living room today. Unplayed. Untouched except to dust it. A physical reminder that some moments don't need to be repeated. They just need to be witnessed. Remembered. Passed on. Jimi Hendrix never needed to prove he was the best. He just needed to show people what best was standing on. And on that March night in 1967, in a cramped Soho studio, he showed Paul McCartney, and 5 other witnesses, that every song has a basement. Most people build on top of it and forget it's there. But Jimi never forgot. He lived in the basements of songs. In the underneath places. And when he played, even for 90 seconds, he brought that hidden architecture into the light. Not to replace what was there. Just to remind you it existed. That's mastery. Quiet. Absolute. Undeniable.